I've built an empire out of fear. In this city, men whisper my name like it's a warning, not a man. I don't do love, I don't do weakness. To me, people are just pieces on a chessboard, and I never lose a game. But that night, I made one mistake. I agreed to a 10-minute favor, a blind date, standing in for a friend who was too terrified to show up. I walked into that dimly lit cafe expecting a distraction. I planned to check my watch, stay for the coffee, and walk back into the shadows where I belong. But the moment I saw Maya, I forgot how to breathe. She wasn't looking for a billionaire or a savior. She sat there with a stack of law books and a fire in her eyes that could level my entire organization. She started talking about justice. She spoke about bringing down the monsters who think they're above the law. She looked me right in the eye, completely unaware that the monster she hated most was sitting 3 feet away, captivated by the way her hair caught the light. For the first time in a decade, my heart didn't feel like stone. It felt like a liability. I should have walked out then. I should have protected her from the truth of who I am. But the air between us was thick and electric, the kind of tension that makes you want to burn the whole world down just to stay in that moment. I stayed for the 10 minutes, then an hour, then a lifetime. She thinks she's meeting a stranger. She has no idea that by the time this night ends, I'll be ready to dismantle my entire legacy just to keep that smile on her face. But secrets in my world don't stay buried. When she finds out who Ethan Cole really is, when she realizes she fell for the very man she's sworn to destroy, will she run? Or will she be the only person brave enough to stay? 10 minutes. That was the deal. But she didn't just change my plans. She changed my soul. I am Ethan Cole. My life is a series of cold calculations made in rooms that smells of expensive bourbon and old secrets. In my world, loyalty is a currency and betrayal is a death sentence. I don't walk into a room. I own it. People don't look me in the eye because they're afraid of what they'll see. A man who has forgotten how to feel anything but the heavy, pulse-thrumming weight of power. My private meetings aren't about handshakes. They are about leverage. I've spent years mastering the art of the untouchable, building a fortress around my heart that no one, not even the most ruthless rival, could ever breach. To me, emotions were nothing more than liabilities. They were the cracks in the armor that let the bullets through. I had no room for the soft, the quiet, or the kind. My empire was built on the premise that I needed no one. I was the king of a hollow city, and I was perfectly fine with the silence. Then came Leo, my childhood friend, the only person who remembers the boy I was before the world turned me into a weapon. He came to me shaking, begging for a favor that felt beneath a man of my standing. A blind date. He'd been set up. He was terrified, and he looked at me with that desperate, "you owe me" expression that only someone who knows your darkest secrets can pull off. I scoffed. The idea of me, Ethan Cole, sitting in a crowded cafe playing the part of a nervous suitor was a joke. I had bodies to bury and millions to move. Gee, but there was a persistent pull, a rare, annoying moment of sentimentality for the only bridge I hadn't burned. 10 minutes, Leo, I warned him, my voice a low rasp that usually made men's knees buckle. I go in, I stay for one drink, and I leave. Don't ever ask me for this again. I thought it was just a wasted evening. I thought I was stepping into a boring conversation with a woman who would likely be impressed by my watch and bored by my silence. I didn't realize I was walking straight into an ambush of the heart. I didn't know that for the first time in my life, I was about to meet someone who didn't care about the empire. Someone who looked at the monster and somehow only saw a man. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and rain-dampened pavement, a world too small and too honest for a man like me. I stepped inside, my coat still slick with the storm, scanning the room with the predatory instinct that never sleeps. I expected a girl looking for a meal ticket or a shy wallflower who wouldn't dare meet my gaze. Instead, I saw her. Maya sat by the window, a halo of street lamp gold catching the edges of her hair. She wasn't just a woman. She was a frequency I hadn't tuned into for a lifetime. She was brighter than the fluorescent hum of the shop, softer than the jagged edges of my daily life, and dangerously radiant in a way that made my pulse skip a beat I hadn't authorized. I sat down, the chair creaking under the weight of a man who didn't belong in such a peaceful place. I waited for the flinch, the stutter, the inevitable moment she'd realize the air in the room had just turned cold. But it never came. She looked at me, truly looked at me, and her voice didn't shake. It steadied me. It was a grounded, melodic contrast to the screaming silence of my own head. She didn't lead with a smile. She led with a challenge, her eyes tracing the hard lines of my face with a terrifyingly accurate intuition. "You have the look of someone who's forgotten how to ask for things," she said, her voice a soft strike to my ribcage. "You don't seem like a good man, Ethan." I felt a smirk pull at the corner of my mouth, a genuine, rusted expression I hadn't used in years. And yet, I leaned in, the scent of her vanilla perfume cutting through the metallic taste of my world. "You're still sitting with me." The shift was instantaneous. It wasn't just attraction, it was a structural failure of my own defenses. A flicker of something fiercely protective ignited in my chest. A sudden, irrational need to shield this girl from the very world I ruled. My curiosity didn't just peak. It curdled into an immediate, dark obsession. I came for 10 minutes to save a friend's reputation. I stayed because, for the first time in my life, I found something I couldn't buy, break, or intimidate, and I knew, right then, I was never letting it go. I couldn't stay away. Every logical instinct told me to burn the bridge, to let that one rain-slicked evening remain a ghost in my memory. But my world felt suddenly, violently gray without her. So I hunted the light. I found reasons to be where she was, appearing in the periphery of her life like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. And I lied. For the first time, the most powerful man in the city was hiding behind a mask of normalcy, terrified that one wrong word would shatter the fragile peace of her presence. The tension between us became a living thing, a wire pulled so taut it hummed. We'd sit in libraries and quiet corners, our fingers hovering over the same pages, the air thick with the electricity of hands that almost, but never quite, touched. I caught myself watching the pulse in her neck, counting the seconds of lingering eye contact that felt more intimate than anything I'd ever bought or stolen. When a stranger's gaze lingered on her for a fraction too long, a cold, possessive territorialism surged through me, a dark reminder of the monster lurking just beneath the tailored suit. Maya was everything my world had tried to kill. She was a law student, fueled by an idealistic, stubborn fire to dismantle the very corruption that fed my empire. She spoke of justice with a passion that made my skin crawl and my heart ache. Every time she smiled at me, believing I was just a man with a complicated past, I felt something structural crack inside my chest. It was a slow, agonizing demolition of the fortress I'd spent decades building. The irony was a bitter, jagged pill. While she spent her nights studying how to bring down men like me, men who ruled through blood and backroom deals. I spent mine watching her sleep through a screen or from a car parked a block away, completely undone by her. She was preparing for a war against my kind, sharpening her blade to strike at the heart of the underworld. And I was already on my knees, falling for the only woman who possessed the power to destroy me without ever firing a single shot. The walls of my fortress were beginning to sweat. Outside the quiet sanctuary I'd built with Maya, the city was screaming. Rival families were sensing a shift in the wind, circling like vultures over a kingdom they thought was finally showing a crack. My phones didn't stop ringing. My hands were stained with the metaphorical ink of death warrants and power plays. Yet my mind was miles away, anchored to a small apartment and a woman who smelled like rain and old books. For the first time in my life, I found myself hesitating. I sat in a soundproofed basement, looking at a man who had betrayed me, and instead of the cold execution of justice, I saw Maya's face. I heard her voice talking about the sanctity of life, about the chance for reform, about the monsters who refuse to change. I didn't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. She was making me question the very foundation of the empire I'd bled to build, turning my ironclad certainties into pillars of salt. Every violent decision felt heavier, a debt I'd eventually have to pay to a woman who didn't even know I was the creditor. Then came the night at the gallery. I was watching from the shadows, a ghost in a bespoke suit, when I saw a man, some trust fund predator with a wandering hand, lean too close to her. He whispered something into her ear, his fingers grazing the small of her back, and the world went red. It wasn't just anger. It was a primitive, bone-deep territorialism that bypassed every layer of my civilized mask. I didn't have a right to her. I hadn't earned the title of her protector, and I certainly hadn't been honest enough to claim her heart. But as I stepped out of the darkness, my pulse a rhythmic thrum of mine, I realized I didn't just want a right. I wanted the world to know that touching her was an invitation to war. I wanted her to be the only thing in my life that wasn't a transaction, even as I prepared to lie to her face one more time. The air in the rain-slicked alleyway turned to ice the moment she saw them. 6 black SUVs, engines idling like growling beasts, and a dozen men in tactical gear who bowed their heads as I approached. The secret I'd been cradling like a stolen diamond shattered against the pavement. Maya stood frozen, her law books clutched to her chest like a shield that was far too thin. The streetlights caught the silver crest on my lapel, the mark of the coal syndicate, and I watched the light in her eyes go out. "Ethan?" Her voice was a whip crack in the silence. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with a clarity that made my soul recoil. "You lied to me." It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her into the darkness where I was king and tell her it didn't matter. But my hands, usually so steady when holding a weapon, were leaden at my sides. I had survived hits, betrayal, and a decade of war without flinching. But as she stepped back, away from the cars, away from the power, away from me, my voice almost broke. I tried to speak, to offer some hollow justification, but the words died in my throat. I was the monster she had been studying to destroy, and for the first time, I saw myself through her lens. She didn't look back. She turned and walked into the rain, her silhouette disappearing into a city that suddenly felt like a tomb. My men waited for a command, for a sign to follow her, to bring her back. But I stood there paralyzed. I've lost soldiers in the dead of night, I've lost blood on the cold concrete of this city. I thought I knew what loss was, but as the sound of her footsteps faded, I realized I'd never actually felt pain until that second. The empire was still mine, but the only thing that made me feel human was gone. The city sensed my distraction like sharks smelling blood in the water. The moment Maya walked away, the vultures descended. Rival families, men I had suppressed for years with a single look, began hitting my supply lines, torching my warehouses, and picking off my perimeter guards. My inner circle was screaming for a massacre. They wanted the old Ethan Cole back, the one who would have leveled 3 city blocks just to send a message. But that man had died in the rain with her. Every time I closed my eyes to plan a counterstrike, I didn't see maps or logistics. I saw the look of absolute soul-deep disappointment in Maya's eyes. Her voice played on a loop in the hollow spaces of my mind, a haunting melody of what could have been. I realized then that she didn't hate me for the power I held. She simply refused to love the monster I had become to get it. She had looked at my empire and seen a graveyard, and for the first time, so did I. The pressure reached a breaking point when my lead lieutenant, Victor, shoved a loaded weapon into my hand after a drive-by hit on our main offices. "They're waiting for the order, Ethan. Give us the word. We burn them all tonight." The cold steel of the gun felt wrong in my palm, heavy, archaic, and utterly useless against the void in my chest. I looked at the weapon, then at the men who lived and died by my capacity for violence, and I felt a strange, terrifying shift in my core. I didn't give the order. I set the gun down on the mahogany desk, the click echoing like a thunderclap in the silent room. "No," I said, my voice like ground glass. "We're not burning anything. We're changing the locks." The shock on their faces was a physical weight, but I didn't care. I was choosing a path that would likely get me killed, but it was the only path that led back to her. I wasn't just refusing to retaliate. I was refusing to be the man she couldn't love. The transition wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, agonizing skinning of my former self. I began the systematic dismantling of everything that had made me feared. One by one, the illegal ports were shuttered, the backroom ledgers burned, and the shell companies restructured into something that could actually stand the light of day. My men looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I wasn't crazy. I was finally awake. I stepped into the public eye, not as the ghost in the machine, but as a man whose face was now synonymous with a radical, transparent corporate overhaul. Every legal document I signed felt like a brick in a new foundation, a silent prayer sent into a city that didn't believe in miracles. I didn't chase her. Every instinct screamed at me to find her apartment, to corner her in the hallway, to beg for a forgiveness I hadn't yet earned. But I knew Maya. She didn't want words. She wanted a reality that didn't crumble under the weight of a lie. So I stayed in the shadows of her life, watching from a distance as she navigated her final year of law school. I became a ghost again, but this time a protective one. I wasn't hunting her. I was becoming someone worthy of being hunted by her. The transformation was lonely. The bourbon tasted like ash without her, and the silence in my penthouse was deafening. But every time I felt the urge to slip back into the cold comfort of the underworld, I remembered the way she'd looked at those law books, with a belief that the world could be better. I wanted to be part of that better. I poured my billions into the very justice system she championed, to building legal clinics and funding the defense of the powerless. I wasn't doing it to buy her back. I was doing it because if she ever looked at me again, If our paths ever crossed in a world that wasn't built on a lie, I wanted her to see a man she could actually choose. Not a monster she was forced to endure, but a partner she could respect. I was stripping away the armor, piece by piece, until all that was left was the man who had sat across from her in a rainy cafe and forgotten how to breathe. The air in the library was thick with the scent of old parchment and the ghost of the woman who had haunted my every waking hour. I didn't approach her like a predator this time. I stood by the tall mahogany shelves, waiting for her to acknowledge the space I occupied. When Maya finally looked up, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the frequency of everything we hadn't said. Her eyes searched mine, no longer clouded by the shock of betrayal, but sharpened by a cautious, agonizing curiosity. The tension was a physical weight, a wire pulled taut across the rows of books. Neither of us moved. I watched the way her breath hitched, the way her hand trembled slightly over the edge of a legal brief. I didn't reach out to steady her. I didn't use my power to close the distance. I simply stayed, letting her see the man who had survived the stripping of his own soul. The unspoken feelings, the longing, the grief, the stubborn, irrational hope, swirled in the quiet air, like dust motes in a shaft of light. "Why did you do it, Ethan?" Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the force of a tidal wave. She closed the distance by a single step, her gaze dropping to the headlines on the newspaper nearby, the ones detailing the dismantling of the coal syndicate. "Why did you change everything you were for a 10-minute date that went wrong?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a strategy. I didn't have a lie. "Because you were the first person to look at me and see a man instead of a monster," I said, my voice rough with a truth I had never dared to speak aloud. "And because you made me want to be that man. Not for you, not to win you back, but because I couldn't live with the version of me that didn't deserve to know you." There was no begging, no grand, cinematic gestures of desperation, just the raw, bleeding edge of mutual respect. I saw the wall she'd built against me begin to show its first hairline fracture. We stood there, two people from warring worlds, finally speaking the same language. I was vulnerable, exposed in a way that no bullet could ever achieve, and as she took one more step toward me, I realized that the slow rebuild of us wasn't going to be about power. It was going to be about the courage to be seen. Just as the foundations of our new world were settling, the universe demanded its final pound of flesh. Maya stood in my office, the light of the setting sun casting long, amber shadows across the blueprints of my legal empire, and held out the letter. An international internship, 6 months in Geneva. It was the opportunity she had bled for, the culmination of every late night and every sacrifice she'd made while I was still playing God in the gutter. You and the old Ethan Cole, the man who ruled by possession, would have dismantled that opportunity before she could even pack a bag. I would have bought the firm, canceled the flight, or built her a gilded cage right here in the city just to keep her within my reach. My hands tightened into fists at my sides, the primitive urge to claim and contain roaring in my blood. I looked at her, and I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the silent fear that I might be the anchor that dragged her down instead of the wind at her back. But loving Maya had taught me a lesson more brutal than any street war. True power isn't holding someone captive. It's being the person they want to return to. I forced my hands to relax. I stepped into her space, not to block her path, but to frame her face in my palms. The silence was thick with the ghost of our past, But the air between us had changed. It was no longer heavy with lies. It was light with a terrifying, beautiful honesty. "Go," I whispered, the word feeling like a jagged stone in my throat. "Show them the fire I saw in that cafe." The shock on her face was quickly replaced by a profound, tear-filled relief. We didn't need a contract or a vow. We chose trust, a currency more valuable than anything I had ever stored in a Swiss vault. I was letting her fly, knowing that for the first time in my life, I wasn't losing something. I was finally giving us a chance to survive the distance, proving that what we had built wasn't a fleeting obsession, but a love that didn't need a leash to stay home. The 6 months didn't pass in days. They passed in the excruciating silence of a penthouse that finally felt like a home, yet remained agonizingly empty. I stood on the tarmac, the cold wind of the city biting at my face, watching the private jet taxi toward the hangar. My heart, the organ I had tried to stone over for decades, was hammering against my ribs with a violence no enemy had ever provoked. When the door opened and Maya stepped out, the gray world I had been navigating suddenly burst into a blinding, technicolor reality. She didn't run. She walked with the grace of a woman who had conquered her own world, her eyes locking onto mine with a steady, unbreakable heat. When she finally reached me, the space between us disappeared in a rush of silk and cedar-scented air. I pulled her into me, my hands shaking as I buried my face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of rain and the promise of a future that wasn't written in blood. The physical tension that had defined us for a year finally dissolved into a deep, soul-level peace. We stood there for a long time, the city lights flickering in the distance like a fallen constellation. I looked at the skyline, the empire I had once ruled through terror, and realized it was nothing compared to the weight of her hand in mine. I had spent my life believing that vulnerability was a death sentence, that to love was to surrender. I was wrong. I built an empire from fear, a fortress of iron and shadow that left me hollowed out and alone. But Maya taught me something stronger. She showed me that true strength isn't the ability to destroy. It's the courage to be reconstructed. Love isn't a weakness, and it isn't a liability. It's the only thing that ever truly made me powerful.